Alright, tubes, got something pretty interesting here for you today. Going to be working on the old Danger Ranger. And what we got to do here is we got to replace the driver's side valve cover gasket. I've had an oil leak for quite some time, and it's not a bad oil leak. You can see a little bit down here. You know, it just leaves like a little drip here and there every once in a while if you park it for a long time. But I don't like having oil leaks if I can avoid them. And so I'd already replaced the passenger side valve cover gasket. That didn't fix the problem. I replaced the lower oil pan gasket. That didn't solve the problem. And so pretty much the last thing it could be, other than the rear main seal, which it very well could be, but I think it's this driver's side valve cover gasket, because if you look down in here, you can see it has been leaking a little bit at least. So we're going to go ahead and try and replace that and see if it fixes it. We got our gasket right here. I picked it up on eBay, and to be honest, I bought it so long ago I can't even remember what it cost me. But it came with the gasket itself and the little grommets too, so it should be everything we need. The driver's side here is a little bit harder to do than the passenger side. It's a little bit less exposed, but not by that much. We just got to start taking stuff off of here. Got to obviously get the coil out of the way. This big connector here has to come out of the way. Our EGR tube is going to be in the way, and a lot of these little sensors and stuff too. So what we're going to do here is this will be kind of like a walkthrough of showing you how I do this, and hopefully we can get this finished pretty soon. Alright, stand by. I think the first thing I'll get out of my way is this big electrical connector, and the way these connectors work is they actually got a bolt that runs all the way through them, and that's what holds it together. So I'm just going to loosen that up, and once we get this bolt loose, the connector itself will just come right apart. I also went ahead and unplugged this connector, and I'm not sure if that would actually be necessary, except for the fact that I've got some auxiliary wiring going on here, and I have it zip tied to this this big connector here. So I think it's going to make it easier for me. Rather than, if I don't have to undo my zip ties, I would rather not. And so what I'm just going to do is, instead of undoing my zip ties, I'm just going to unhook this connector, and that way I can just slide this whole big thing out off to the side here, and that should be okay. Now the other half of this connector here is actually connected to the valve cover. You got a little bracket here that's bolted to the valve cover, and then there's a clip on this connector that hooks it to that bracket. So I think it would be 6 of one, half dozen of the other, whether we took the whole bracket off or just unclip this. But I think what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to stick a screwdriver in here and just unclip this thing, and we could just pull this thing off of the bracket and, you know, kind of hold that out of the way. Once we get this coil out of here, that'll give us a little more room. We can get this a little farther away too. The coil pack's held on by a fairly extensive bracket. I think it's only got 4 bolts that hold it on though. One of them is actually missing here on mine, and there's another one back over here, and then the bracket runs all the way down here, and from what I can see, there's 2 bolts. There's one right here and there's one right here, and of course both of them have decent bit of oil on them, which I'm hoping is a good sign. So I'm going to take all 4 of those bolts out, or in my case 3, and I'm also going to take all of the spark plug wires off. Now you could mark these beforehand, but I'm just going to look them up later and figure out where they go. But keep that in mind, if you're going to take these off, you don't know where they go, make sure you have a game plan on figuring out where they go. I've got all the spark plug wires disconnected, and from what I could see, the only other things holding this thing on were this connector in the back, so I've unplugged that. This little holder here for the spark plugs has one of those Christmas tree type things. That was going through there, so I pulled that out. And then the throttle cable right here also was held on with a little fastener, so I just pulled that out. So as far as I know, from what I can see, there's only one other thing, which is this wire here. And had I not been doing something else here, that wouldn't have been a problem. But I think I'll just have to take this thing off of here with another extra bolt. So that's just me for my particular setup here. But otherwise, if you took everything I took off, I'm pretty sure this thing will be ready to come out. Once we get that thing out of the way, that does clear up quite a bit of room, and at this point I'm kind of just going around and looking and seeing what's still in my way. Like, for example, there's this connector here. This is for your EGR. That's a sensor, and so there's a connector on there, so I'm going to slide that off. I actually could just pull this thing literally just slides off of here, so while I'm at it, maybe I'll disconnect the other stuff that's hooked to it and just get that out of the way. We got this thing here. I'm pretty sure this is actually a fuel line, and there was a bolt through here holding that fuel line on, and so I took the bolt out. I'm not sure if I'm going to take the fuel line off completely. I'd rather not, and it might be possible they can actually just swing this thing out of the way. So we'll see about that. This here is your cam position sensor, and there's a connector hooked on that, and the way that's held on is it's got this little clip on there. So I just popped it off with a screwdriver. You got to be careful though, otherwise it'll shoot somewhere and you'll never find it. So I mean, it might even be a good idea to like tie some fishing line to it, so that way when it does pop off you don't lose it. But that's off of there, so now we can take this connector off, and that'll start freeing up some space. Here's some vacuum lines going to this. This is also for, actually this is your solenoid for your evap system, but we can pull both of those vacuum lines off and get those out of our way. I'm going to pull this off the top here, and that way I can just eventually get those off all in one piece. This line here is also for your evap system, and that just pulls right off. That goes to your manifolds. It's a vacuum line, and so I've already pulled it off, so I'm going to slide that back and get that out of our way. It's just held to the valve cover with another one of those Christmas tree connectors. You get those things all over the place. Alright, so in getting these vacuum lines out of here, I got this big one out of the way, but there's one more here, and it's held on with the same type of connector, and as you can see I actually pulled this out of there was like tape wrapped around this to hold that on. I actually just pulled it right out, and instead of messing around with this vacuum line and pulling on it and end up cracking it, what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to bite the bullet, and I'm going to take this one little bolt out and just take this whole bracket out of the way. Because once that bracket's out of the way, we can just disconnect the vacuum lines here and then just move that whole thing out of the way, and we don't have to worry about dealing with those connectors and what have you. So push that out of the way over there. This wiring here, that can get pushed up under here out of the way. Alright, I got this connector off here, so I'm able to push this out of the way, and at this point we're getting pretty close. There's not a whole lot of stuff that's really on our way here. I think at this point, if we just mess around with it, we can probably wiggle this valve cover around it and get it out of here. So I'm going to pull the bolts out of it, and there's not many bolts holding this on. If I remember correctly, there's 6 of them. There's one on each corner, so there's 2 here, 2 back here, and then 2 in the middle. You can see the one down here, and I don't know if you could really see the other one right now. There it is. There's one right there, and then of course the hardest one to see is the one right back in the corner here. That's right there. So if we take those 6 bolts out, valve cover will be nice and loose, and we can see if we get it out of here. Alright, bolts are out. This thing's loose. So I'm going to put you on the tripod here and just kind of play around with this thing and see if I can get this thing out without having to take this fuel line off. But if we got to take it off, that's just what we'll do. So I was just looking at this thing, and I decided before I even tried to take it out, I'd just undo that fuel line, because there's literally just 2 bolts that hold it on, and then there's an O-ring in there which kind of looks a little messed up, so I might need to think about replacing that before I put it back on. But either way, that's out of the way, and I just pulled it back and tucked the fuel line behind the EGR here, and just make it a little easier. One less thing I gotta fight with. But at this point now, I think that this thing should come out relatively easy, because this thing here, I'm leaving it on, but I can bend that. There's a lot of flex in there, and pretty much other than that, there's really not much in the way here. Alright, so we got our valve cover out here, and it does look like it was a little, maybe a little extra smashed, especially here, but it's always hard to make a call. But there is definitely oil around here. That could have just came from, as soon as I took it off. But either way, it's off now, so we're obviously not going to put it back on without replacing it. Alright, so I just went around here and cleaned up the gasket surface pretty good. There's a little bit of staining going on, so it looks like there's still dirt on there. That's actually staining as opposed to dirt, sitting on the surface there. So we took care of that. And there was a little bit of dirt in there, vacuumed all that out. And I'll go show you the valve cover, what we did with that, and we're very ready to put it back on. Got our valve cover here. I cleaned it up a little bit and put brand new grommets in it. Used the old studs and bolts, of course, nothing wrong with them, but I did put new grommets in it. And we got our new valve cover on here. Looks a lot better than the old one, but the old one was pretty flat compared to this one. So hopefully makes a difference. I'm going to make sure this thing's seated properly and what have you, and then I'll go reinstall it. Alright. So I've got the valve cover back in here, and I just I snugged all the bolts down there. None of them are tight though. but I snugged it in place. And just two things I want to mention real quick before I forget. Number one, I couldn't get this nut loose on the EGR, so what I did instead is I just took these two bolts out of here and that loosened it up so that way I could move this thing. And again, all it needed was a little bit extra flex to help me get it out of the way. So there's that. Keep that in mind if you need to move your EGR. That's another option of another way to do it. And the other thing is as you're installing this, you just got to keep in mind, watch your gasket, make sure it doesn't fall out of the groove and get bunched up, because if that happens, it's not going to seal up too well. So you just got to be careful, make sure it stays in there, and once you get it in there, before you start actually bolting it down, just lift it up, reach underneath, make sure it feels like it's the way it's supposed to be. And if you're good to go there, then start tightening the bolts down like I'm about to do. Alrighty. Alright, now at this point in time, it's just simply a matter of hooking everything back up. I've already hooked up our fuel line. I've already hooked the EGR back up. And speaking of that, just keep in mind when you do your fuel line, make sure you don't have your fuel line on this side of the EGR before you bolt it on, otherwise you won't be able to get it back over. And you don't want this trapped under the EGR, because heat and fuel would probably not be good. So this thing's got to come up along like that. So I put that back in there, put the bolt back in for that bracket. I started plugging in a bunch of connectors here. Got our vacuum lines back in place, and so just going to keep on doing it like that. Got another vacuum line here, got this one that runs in there, so that's just what we're going to keep doing here, get all our lines in place, and then I think after that we'll put our coil back on, double check, make sure we didn't miss anything, and start it up. Alright, as far as I know, everything here is installed. Got all the coil spark plug wires hooked back up in the correct fashion, I think. We'll find out in a minute. All our vacuum lines are hooked up, all our connectors, our big electrical connector here, fuel lines, EGR, everything. So what I'm going to do here is, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn the ignition on. Just going to turn the ignition on so the fuel pump primes, and we'll look over at that connector, that fuel hookup there, see if it looks like it's leaking, which I would say it does not appear to be leaking. Alright, so far so good with this thing. I got a little test drive in, and so far everything looks dry. I don't really see any leaking going on like I did before. So hopefully this will finally solve the problem, because again, I don't know if I forget if I actually mentioned this at the beginning, but about a year ago I had replaced this valve cover gasket, and actually ended up having to replace the whole cover because I found a crack in it. But that still didn't fix the oil leak I had. And then so I did the lower oil pan gasket, which I made a video on, and it still didn't solve the problem. So finally we're doing this, and if it's not that, it's probably the rear main seal. And it's not really a big issue, because the size of the oil leak we're talking here is like minuscule. But I don't like to have any drips under my truck if I can avoid it. So yeah, I think that's about going to do it for this video. So thanks for watching. Hopefully it was helpful to somebody. Hopefully you enjoyed. Don't forget to subscribe, give it a like if it was helpful or if you liked it, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, tubes.